This rip of TFTC was brought to you by River. It's the best place to buy Bitcoin. Go to river.com/TFTC and enjoy this episode.
Matthew Pines, long time coming. Can't believe this is your first time on the show.
It is. Wow. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here. We have a lot to talk about. Let's start with the Trump bump. Is the Trump bump coming?
TBD. I know that there's a lot of folks working the angles behind the scenes to try to get sort of play each political side off of each other. And it seems like the Trump camp has been a little bit more cooperative in listening to the digital assets industry. And we'll see. I know Biden has tried to adjust tact. We'll see if that manifests in a policy stance that will attract similar donations. But yeah, it seems like at this point he's going all in. And I know that whatever a future administration eventually turns into, it seems like a digital assets policy plank that's very positive for the industry is likely coming.
Yeah. Given your experience in DC and being around these conversations for years, how would you describe the reaction that you alluded to from the Biden campaign and where we sit now as an industry politically? It seems that we're definitely entering a phase where the voting bloc built up of individuals who want to see Bitcoin and broader crypto succeed have a voice that is being listened to, which I'm not going to lie, is a bit of a shock. I didn't think it was going to happen this soon, but here we are.
Yeah, I think it's two things. One is like the price is like to first order the political valence of digital assets as a function of the price, right? So when the price is dumping, when it's 15K, 20K, politicians don't care, right? It's dead. It's moving on. It's not a very top of the ticket item. When now it's reaching close to all-time highs, that draws political attention. And to a certain extent, our political system is driven by money, right? It's not really driven by mass preference. It's driven by who can help support different electoral slates of candidates. And I think when the Republican candidate showed a willingness to sort of engage with the crypto community, and that resulted in financial commitments, I think the Democrats saw that as a potential strategic disadvantage. And I think there's some folks in that camp that are much more about, okay, what does it take to win? And aren't necessarily aligned with the Elizabeth Warren wing, sort of quote unquote crypto army, and are trying to, develop relationships and send maybe backdoor entreaties to the Bitcoin and crypto communities to try to get some of their support. I'm not sure how successful that's been recently, but I think Trump's sort of hard and explicit endorsement of Bitcoin and digital assets more generally has sort of set the marker. And it remains to be seen if the Democrats are gonna ante up. And I think that's where the dividing line is in terms of the strategist level, in terms of the folks that are running the campaign are just looking at battleground states, and it's coming down to a few 100,000 votes, and all the money and all the effort to win a campaign is leveraged on a small number of sort of flips. And so any advantage or disadvantage really is magnified in importance. And so this is where I think the broader digital assets industry has now come into its own as a result of several years of kind of building, progressively stronger political muscles. I think 4 years ago, the idea of engaging in politics, especially for true Bitcoiners, was seen as anathema, right? Like, you're just compromising, you're selling out to the man. Why even getting involved? Politics is, a grubby business. Like, we should just build and, ignore the politicians. And I think at least, there's certain strains of belief that still hold to that. But I think a larger swath of politically active and engaged Bitcoiners and other folks in the broader industry have realized that, it is potentially existential for the industry in the United States, not necessarily globally. It's just a matter of whether the U.S. Plants a flag in that new territory or whether it cedes ground to others around the world.
Yeah, not going to lie. I fell into the former camp at one point. I think combination of you, others at the Bitcoin Policy Institute and in the industry, NVK, over at CoinKite, pretty thoroughly convinced me that you may not care about the politicians, but the politicians care about you. It's probably best to engage, put your best foot forward, because we actually do have a good story to tell, a good narrative. I think idea of Bitcoin being this reinvigorating force within the American economy has a lot of strong legs to it and a lot of validation behind it up to this point, particularly within the energy sector, and obviously from the aspect of it being an asset that can protect you against inflation. These are very strong narratives that Americans desperately need at this given point in time. So I guess, how would you pitch Bitcoin to politicians as this vehicle to reinvigorate the American economy? Why should America want to lead when it comes to Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, I've had the occasion to provide some white papers and talking points to some candidates on both sides of the aisle, on the Senate side and the White House, to help, at least from my position as someone who looks at geopolitical risk, national security, which has been obviously a consistent theme, mostly on the negative side, and how policymakers have assessed Bitcoin and digital assets more generally as being a potential risk for national security. And I have tried to make an argument, I think, reasonably so, that in fact the net benefits to U.S. national security and our geopolitical position from Bitcoin are positive and quite strong if we take advantage of our unique position at the moment. And so I've articulated that in a number of different forums, long white papers. I think the key thrust of my argument has been, one, like the legacy monetary financial system that we constructed sort of the post-war era and really sort of fine-tuned in the last 50 years, sort of like all sorts of systems, they start off being quite well optimized for a certain geopolitical status quo, a certain arrangement of trade and financial flows. And they get sort of optimized for that set of arrangements, and they accrue lots of power to the system that set them up. And that's sort of the system that we've been running for the last 50 years. And it's, I think, progressively reached a point of diminishing marginal returns, and in fact now probably creating increasing marginal costs on our overall global position and our domestic stability, in the sense that we have essentially sold off our manufacturing base. We no longer have a defense industrial capacity to credibly deter our great power adversaries. That's a direct downstream function of the fact that we effectively have to print debt to supply global demand. That's a result of us running structural trade and capital account deficits, and our adversaries accumulate dollars and reinvest them historically into our debt. And that mechanism, that sort of global dollar recycling, is led to the benefit of our fire sector and our tech sector, but has sort of systematically atrophied sort of the core elements of domestic manufacturing and industrial power that you really need to have if you get into global conflict. And so that's increasingly seen as a risk, an acute risk in the defense intelligence communities. But that's a hard sort of thing to unwind. The second is, so that's like essentially the legacy system is an acute vulnerability, and it's growing as a vulnerability. It's in creating acute sort of fragilities in our debt markets that our policymakers essentially have to keep sort of scrambling to contain, and that distracts our strategic attention. The second is our adversaries are really not fighting to first order a global physical conflict, although there's proxy wars. The main argument is that they're fighting essentially a digital network competition. And the global economy is effectively a digital set of systems, whether it's the financial systems, the computing systems, other communication systems. And it's about capturing sort of key nodes in that global system, and those rapidly changing sort of topology of those global networks is where sort of the front lines of global competition reside. And so it's not really a matter of physical territory to first order. It's about capturing sort of strategic advantage over core nodes in an emerging set of digital systems that are now increasingly interlinked between value, energy, and communication. And those are the systems that are going to determine who sort of maintains dominance in the next 10, 20 years. And I think if we just sort of pretend that these changes aren't happening, and we sort of just double down on sort of the legacy systems that we've rode to global dominance on, that we're exposing ourselves to an acute risk of being rug pulled strategically in the next 5 or 10 years. And that is something that doesn't happen. It's hard to sort of get policymakers to think about those changes because they sort of start in the margins. They seem easy to dismiss. They seem like flashes in a pan or sort of somewhat trivial peripheral issues until they're not. And that's I think the lesson of global power politics is that these changes can accrue and get momentum and then they're sort of hard to stop unless you've seen ahead. So that's what I've talked about in terms of our existing system is leading to and has caused strategic vulnerabilities. Our adversaries are sort of jumping ahead to try to capture strategic advantage of these emerging digital networks. And unless we recognize that this is an inflection point, and we just double down on our existing systems, which are increasingly fragile and require ever more effort to sustain, we're not in a good position to counter authoritarian objectives around the world. So that's the way I sort of frame it in terms of Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins, as essentially helping to buttress and transform, but in a more gradual form, a global system that is still open, is still fundamentally liberal, is still oriented towards sort of the core values that America at least holds up for itself historically in terms of freedom, property value, property rights, human rights, et cetera. So that's kind of the stakes, and I think we're going to see that unfold in the next few years. So how we sort of set our political and our geopolitical orientation to those emerging systems, whether we're actively hostile to them and allow folks like the Emirates or the Singaporeans or Hong Kong to become kind of the dominant nodes in those emerging networks, or whether we retain our place in those emerging systems and then can compete effectively in a shifting global system.
This episode was presented by River. River is the best, most secure place to buy Bitcoin in the United States. Go to river.com/TFTC, set up an account today. You'll be able to DCA into Bitcoin without paying any fees. You'll be able to give people Bitcoin via River links. You'll be able to send and receive Bitcoin over the Lightning Network, and you'll be able to set limit orders. If you want to buy Bitcoin at a particular price below or above where it is now, you can set orders to buy Bitcoin when it hits that price. Go to river.com/TFTC and set up your account today. This trip was also brought to you by our good friends at Unchained. Unchained is building a financial services platform for a Bitcoin standard. They have over 7,000 clients that are securing over 90,000 Bitcoin with 12,000 keys on their platform. Their platform leverages Bitcoin's native multi-sig properties. Their cornerstone product is their Vault product, a 2 of 3 multi-sig Vault, which allows you to hold 2 of 3 keys in a multi-sig quorum. That gives you full control over your Bitcoin. They also have an IRA product, a lending desk, and they're rolling out a bunch of other products, including an inheritance protocol and sound advisory. So go to unchained.com, set up a call with their concierge onboarding team today. Tell them that TFTC sent you and use the promo code TFTC at checkout. Unchained.com.
It's not looking good, and I'm happy that people like you are ringing the alarm bells for this. I mean, what are your thoughts on the BRICS meeting yesterday? There's been a lot of talk. I think it's an X rumor. There was the meme going around over the weekend that the petrodollar contract agreement expired on June 9th if it wasn't re-signed. But I did some research last night. Didn't look like it existed in the first place. Sunday was the 50th anniversary of the petrodollar coming to life. But regardless of whether or not that contract exists and whether or not it was re-upped, Saudi Arabia is officially part of the BRICS coalition, whatever they're defining it as. And there was a big meeting yesterday in Russia in which the BRICS countries talked about areas they want to focus on, everything from global governance to climate change. And one of the important points that was brought up that is pertinent to this show and what we do as Bitcoiners is the fact that these countries want to begin settling financial transactions in their native currencies instead of having to go through the petrodollar system.
Yeah, I think so. The BRICS and the whole de-dollarization narrative gets muddled in various ways, and sometimes there's a lot of motivated reasoning behind the core geopolitical analysis and the realpolitik and the inherent constraints placed upon those actors in the existing global system. Not to say they have aspirations, but I sort of calibrate what's plausible and what's likely. To first order, the BRICS coalition or aggregation is not a monetary military alliance. It's essentially an economic arrangement of collaboration and partnerships at various stages and various sort of strengths. So in that sense, it's like a G20. So it doesn't necessarily commit members to a whole lot of kind of mutual or bilateral commitments, but it expresses kind of an orientation to certain political values and patterns of trade that I think reflect a larger pattern of multipolarity, right? That I think that's pretty obvious at this point, that there is no dominant hegemonic power like the United States that can just police all the world's hotspots and sort of enforce a certain system of rules and state behavior that it was able to kind of do in its hyperpower moment. That system is gone. And so we're seeing a sort of this emerging new pattern. It hasn't yet set into a new equilibrium. And so multipolarity, unlike the Cold War sort of bipolar system or kind of the short post-war sort of unipolar hegemonic moment, which were quasi-stable systems where you could have kind of two great power systems essentially compete for the world and kind of divide up, and all sort of middle powers had to kind of pick a side. Most non-aligned powers, were kind of on the margins. In the post-war era, the United States could kind of rule the roost for a short period of time. Now you're seeing kind of emerging challenger powers and middle powers and balancing powers kind of all kind of recalibrate their relationships globally. And that hasn't resolved itself into a new equilibrium, right? It's still very much an unsettled state. And so the BRICS phenomenon, which is kind of a misnomer in terms of the membership now, it kind of spans many different countries and many different continents. And many folks that are members of BRICS are also strategic partners and allies of the United States, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of folks that are essentially, especially in the Gulf countries, and some folks in South America, that are essentially trying to play both sides, right? As you see, essentially in a multipolar system, is sort of geopolitical promiscuity, right? Where there isn't just one major power that you kind of have to pay fealty to. Now there are multiple powers that are all vying, multiple great powers are all vying for influence, and they can sort of and those middle powers can sort of, play each side off each other to get benefits for themselves. I think you're seeing folks like the Saudis and the Emiratis really being successful at that strategy. And so what that has implications for in terms of the monetary and financial system, I think is very important, because many of those countries want to preserve as much as possible their strategic autonomy, right? They want to have as much sort of optionality in how they conduct their economic affairs as possible. And they recognize they're sort of emerging from a legacy system where, because it was so subject to such hegemonic dominance by the United States, they didn't have that flexibility, right? So the Saudis in the 70s, right, the main arrangement there was pretty clear. It was, we will provide military protection, you'll buy our arms and weapons, you'll sell your oil for dollars, and you'll recycle those dollars back into our weapons and our debt. And you did that for 50 years, and we hold those. We agreed to hold your treasury securities in a secret account because for regional sort of politics, the Saudis didn't want to have it be known that they were funding essentially U.S. military. And that arrangement is now kind of reaching its end point, but it could still sustain under a different logical basis, especially the relationship between U.S. And the Gulf countries and China is I think the most important kind of prism to see these changing dynamics. In particular, if you look at those Gulf states that they're now sitting on trillions of dollars of dollar reserves, many of which have been moved into sovereign wealth funds, and those sovereign wealth funds have then been deployed for strategic purposes for those Gulf countries to try to do a few things. But one of the most important things is try to transform their domestic petrostate economies into more leading edge technology and emerging energy sort of technology. So they are trying to transform their position in the global sort of economic system from just being a provider of raw commodities to being a kind of a key hub for AI, semiconductors, telecommunications networks, and hubs throughout the region in Africa. And so that is their strategic objectives. And so their monetary plans are always going to be sort of downstream of their larger strategic objectives. And so, for example, if they can acquire valuable assets and technologies using dollars, then they'll redeploy those dollars to the AI sort of venture ecosystem. And they'll try to then use that influence to pull some of that technology and that capital and that talent domestically to build out their own indigenous capacities to sort of reinforce their role as an innovation hub for those technologies. If China can offer military support, intelligence support, security support, as well as other technologies like Huawei 5G or construction expertise for big mega projects, then they'll look to recycle those surpluses to the Chinese. And if the Chinese want to, demand payment in yuan for those services, then it's likely that will happen. So I think you'll see kind of on the margin, a rebalancing away from those petrostates from pure dollar-based recycling into whatever unit of account is necessary to purchase the strategic services and goods from essentially whether it's a U.S. or a China tech and industrial ecosystem. And I think that's what you're probably going to see. It's going to sort of take place on the margins. But for that sort of China shift or China balancing to take place, they kind of need to have new infrastructure, new financial infrastructure kind of created, right? Because this doesn't happen overnight. It's not just a political decision to sort of redenominate sales. It usually requires, setting up, financial and institutional infrastructure. And I think one of the key pieces of the infrastructure that's being put in place is exemplified by Project Enbridge, which is kind of a cross-bridge CBDC project sponsored by the BIS, but essentially it's essentially a Chinese project with several South Asian states and importantly now Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And so you can imagine if that sort of starts to scale, become like an institutional, and state level system to actually hold, lots of transactions. Kind of a way to kind of bypass the legacy dollar clearing and settlement system, right? I think a lot of folks in the Middle East sort of resent the fact that if they want to send a dollar payment, essentially has to go east before it can go. it has to go west before it goes east, right? It has to essentially be routed through the chips clearing network in New York before it sort of waterfalls through the correspondent sort of banking system to whether it's a bank in Vietnam or a bank in the Philippines, right? And so I think that logic holds both at the state level, where they don't like to be vulnerable to these potential surveillance and choke points powers that the United States has over the dollar financial network via things like OFAC and FinCEN. So OFAC gives us sort of a choke point capability over the global dollar system, and FinCEN gives us sort of a global surveillance capability. And if you're a middle power, you are trying to remove as much possible elements of or points of coercion or exposure you have to another great power. And so you want to have redundancies, right? You want to have backups. You want to have alternative sort of clearing and settlement systems so that you can conduct your trade, that you have the strategic autonomy that you desire. And so I think that's all basically motivating the construction of these alternative digital arrangements at the state level. And I think it also is going to cascade, and you're seeing it be motivated at the individual level, like with dollar-based stablecoins. For example, if you're a foreign worker in the Emirates and you're getting paid in dollars or local currency, and you want to send that back as a remittance payment to your family in, say, the Philippines or in India, well, as with all remittance payments, you're going to be taking massive hit on all those different fees. Whereas if you can just send a stablecoin, essentially peer to peer from your self-hosted wallet to your cousin or your wife's wallet back in the Philippines or in India, well, that has a lot of value to you. And I think that's an endogenous demand for the populations in those countries as well. So I think all those trends are sort of pushing in this direction of a proliferation of novel digital financial networks, and the sort of legacy correspondent banking system that emerged in the post-war era that sort of has been the mechanism by which the U.S. has kind of projected financial economic dominance. It sort of has reached a high watermark, I would say. Doesn't mean it's going to collapse, but it means that there's now a strong incentive and also just endogenous technological drivers behind the creation of alternative financial systems and networks that the United States, if it either just ignores that those are being created, or can help steer and shape how those get formed and which of those key nodes emerge in those new networks.
Perfect layup for my next question, which was, are we asleep at the wheel? Because it seems that a lot of this has been somewhat choreographed, and it's almost like the U.S. financial system is a frog slowly boiling in water as other nations begin to form alliances and do things outside of the purview of the dollar system. And I think I was going through your Twitter earlier today, and Logan, you can pull it up, but you tweeted last year, quote tweeting, or a quote from the Saudi Aramco CEO from March 2021, basically signaling that Saudi Aramco is really going to lean into supplying China with energy for the next 50 years and signaling that there's going to be a stronger relationship between China and Saudi Aramco specifically, but the illusion there is that Saudi Arabia, the country as well. And so it seems like a lot of moves have been made on the chessboard. Bitcoiners and other macro analysts have been calling this out for many years, the quote unquote oil wars or the BRICS currency wars, whatever you want to name them. And at least from my perspective, looking at what the current administration has done over the last 4 years, it seems like we've been asleep at the wheel. And a lot of this has been happening with little to no pushback. Is that a correct assumption in your view, or is the U.S. government doing something to position themselves for relative success moving forward?
I think we belatedly woke up to the strategic implications of China's, success in both recruiting and also engaging diplomatically in the region. And I think the biggest manifestation of that was before the October 7th Hamas attacks. China was very much now like a Middle East player and was basically developing and secured a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So it's kind of a historical achievement where China was now essentially the diplomatic power broker in the Middle East, which for the United States' historical standpoint was kind of like an oh shit moment. And I think, there isn't like always an all or nothing thing. And there's always like countervailing objectives that say the Saudis have in playing off the Chinese against the United States for their own strategic purposes. Obviously, China looks to the Saudi Arabia as a critical provider of their commodities, right? That's like the foundation of their relationship. They just rely on those energy imports. So, China has also reciprocated by providing, ballistic missile support and is willing to accommodate Saudi's, adventures in other parts of the world, as part of kind of there's a certain part of this which is geopolitics, and there's a certain part of this which is you have to think about the CCP, the ruling families of the Gulf countries as their own sort of like extractive mafia, right? And so some parts of these relations are motivated and sort of seen through the prism of states with tax bases and populations and big bureaucracies. And some parts of these relations are, essentially motivated as like different mafias, like carving up territory, right? And doing deals to support each other's, criminal efforts, sort of criminal endeavors. And I think, to a certain extent, you can see the ruling families of like the Emiratis and the Saudis and the CCP essentially as like mafia families. And you have to kind of model that into how you think about how they see the world. And to a certain extent, look at, because if they're essentially small groups of people that control vast quantities of wealth, they can do things that, don't look like traditional state behavior, right? They don't look like, setting up military bases. They don't look like, doing port calls with aircraft carriers or doing training missions, et cetera, right? They look like venture capital deals. They look like, cut out LLCs putting millions of dollars into Western banks and financial institutions. And those are for other strategic purposes, whether it's to acquire strategic technologies or investments in different firms, whether it's to influence the political systems in the West, via outright corruption or political, donations. And I think we have sort of discounted the nature of the sort of Saudi or sort of the Gulf East alignment is essentially, if you zoom out, like where the surpluses are, they were essentially in Russia. They're essentially in petrostates and in manufacturing, powers, essentially, OPEC plus in China. And so the way that the U.S. has sort of run the last 50 years is that, we would be the consumer of global goods. And so therefore we would essentially stimulate the economies of the global South, these emerging markets that produce raw commodities and then climb the value chain in manufacturing. And then they would recycle those dollars into our debts in a sort of a controlled, safe fashion where we could sustain the benefits. I think those emerging powers sort of woke up, though, and they realized they could leverage those dollars to essentially corrupt the imperial core, right? To sort of insinuate themselves into our system and to extract strategic benefits for themselves. And I think that's what you see now. And I think though the Russia, invasion has sort of broken kind of one aspect of that, what was more of like a quasi, like just pretend it's not happening arrangement, because now we had to go out and sanction all the Russian oligarchs. And that kind of broke sort of an implicit part of the deal, right? Was the Russian oligarchs and everyone in the Russian system could get immensely wealthy, and they would just recycle their wealth into Manhattan, South Beach, Miami, London Mayfair, real estate, et cetera. And then Russia invaded, and now we have to sanction all those oligarchs, seize their yachts, seize their property, et cetera. And I think that signal then was cascaded down through what I call this kind of this state quasi mafias who were doing the same sort of thing for the past 30 years. And now they have to look at that arrangement very differently. And so those Gulf powers, those Gulf elite royal families, the Chinese sort of elite families that have hundreds of billions of dollars in real estate overseas, they have to sort of reassess the risk to those assets and start to find alternatives, right, to protect those assets, right, and also try to construct alternative financial institutions that are more safe for them. So like a great example of this is Switzerland. So Switzerland has been seen as like this bastion of financial autonomy and independence and banking secrecy for 100 plus years. It's where all the world's rogues kind of hide their money in Swiss numbered accounts or just gold bullion inside mountains. And they looked at the Russian invasion, the sanctions, and the Swiss government passed changes to their bank secrecy laws that essentially undid a huge portion of the secrecy protections, and then a number of accounts were essentially unmasked and had assets seized. And that I think is sends like a shockwave, not at the geopolitical level to first order, but to like those like networks of mafias that control trillions of dollars, right? But also happen to be, sort of heads of states or cousins of the heads of states, right? And so it does have geopolitical impacts, because what it then precipitates is, for example, the emergence of alternative financial centers like Abu Dhabi Global Markets in Abu Dhabi or DIFC in Dubai, that are now trying to essentially position themselves as alternative financial centers to absorb some of that scared capital, right? And so to the extent that this capital starts to flow out of, say, the city of London, flow out of Switzerland, flow out of New York and Miami real estate, into Abu Dhabi, into Dubai, into Singapore, into Hong Kong, that is a strategic challenge to the sort of the whole global arrangement, right? Now, Saudi Arabia, so this is where it's like oil matters, but it's like oil is just one input into like, okay, they sell the oil, but then they get a bunch of dollars. What do they do with those dollars, right? That actually matters a lot more than just the unit of account they used to sell the commodity itself. Because it's that capital that is what provides power, depending on how it's deployed in the global system. If it just sits in a treasury account, at the Fed, it doesn't give the Saudis a whole lot of power. It's safe to the extent that they think that it's not going to be, blocked or devalued, which is increasingly a new risk they have to price in. But they also realize that the value of that capital can be deployed much more strategically. And so this is why you've seen the emergence of sovereign wealth funds like the PIF, like ADQ, like ADIA, like MGX, and also the Chinese have their own sort of sovereign leverage funds to do something similar. And so the world is now being sort of shaped not just by kind of traditional geopolitical arrangements or sort of tit for tat kind of traditional diplomatic and military kind of positioning, but now the sort of networks of immense global capital flows that are controlled by a small number of sort of autocrat sort of elites in the Gulf and in Asia. And the West sort of has a strategic vulnerability to that, right? Because if you talk to any venture capitalist now or private equity firm, what they'll tell you is that like the marginal source of new dollar investment is coming from the Middle East. It's coming from Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain to a certain extent. And so he who writes the checks calls the tune, right? So you have like just like shuttle flights of venture capital heads and private equity honchos just flying back and forth to Riyadh, to Dubai, to Abu Dhabi, essentially begging for money, right? Essentially trying to make themselves friends of the elite sort of families that run those sovereign wealth funds. And if those same venture capital funds are investing in what we would call like deep tech, right, the kind of strategic technologies that we think are going to be necessary to maintain our economic dominance, and say aerospace and defense, the emerging space economy, AI in particular, but also quantum information systems, synthetic biology. These are kind of the frontier of strategic technology competition that we sort of currently have a critical lead in. But those ecosystems are now effectively being penetrated, compromised by Saudi and Emirati money, which is literally looking not just for like ROI, like a traditional venture capital investor would be, but they're looking for strategic advantage. They want those technologies, produced, and they want those champions domestically. They want to have those sort of innovation clusters within their own jurisdiction. They want to have the chip fabs. They want to have the training data centers. They want to have the AI researchers. They want to have the synthetic biology labs. They want to have the space launch and satellite design. They want to have those technologies and those industries inside their own countries. And so they're aggressively deploying those capital to capture the strategic frontier and try to pull, using that influence, pull those industries domestically. And so that's, I think, is where the new battle lines of strategic competition are. It's not just over kind of who's going to dominate oil or gas in what unit of account, but it's also who's going to dominate these emerging strategic industries. And the traditional frame has been kind of US versus China. And the Emiratis and the Saudis have been really clever in positioning themselves in between to sort of play each side off each other and to sort of position themselves as sort of like neutral ground, both for scared capital as well as for these emerging technologies. We'll see if this gambit plays out sort of in very much the early innings. But that is, I think, a new dimension of global competition that we're going to see kind of probably become much more important in the next few years.
Yeah, this is the reason I wanted to bring you on, because we had a conversation about this off the record probably about a month ago. No, at this point, but I mean, I can just confirm personally. It when you talk about like strategically taking advantage of an opportunity, the Middle East, particularly the UAE, Saudis, Qataris, Emiratis, in that region, they've really taken advantage. Because if you look at what's happened domestically here in the U.S. in the venture capital market post 2020, you had insane blow up in terms of asset bubble blow up in 2020, 21, and you had a lot of funds raise a lot of money, deploy a lot of capital at insanely inflated valuations. And 2022, 2023, with the market downturn, it really put venture capitalists in America in weird positions because they didn't have any returns to their investors from their 2020, 2021 vintages, and the LPs were sitting on the sidelines, seeing that they were extremely overexposed to private equity. And so they all sat on their hands saying, hey, we're not going to, not all of them, but a good portion of the capital that would traditionally write checks into venture capital funds has said, hey, we're going to take a break here, wait until our portfolio allocations rebalance and it makes more sense for us to allocate to private equity. And you have the Middle East countries swoop in and say, hey, we've got money. We can fill those funds up if you need them. And they have obscene amounts of money. And I mean, I've seen it in the Bitcoin space as well. I mean, it's pretty public too. You just look at the amount of people that are going over to Dubai specifically to spin up companies and domicile parts of their company in the Middle East and Dubai specifically, and buddy up with the capital allocators there. And it is purely incentive driven, where it's like, hey, we're running a business here where we need to raise and deploy money. We're not able to raise in the US, so we're going to go to where the money is. And that's how it's played out the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, they have, it's not just the money too. I think in digital assets, they have really provided kind of a red carpet for businesses, very light touch regulatory, very fast bureaucratic approvals, very much kind of like a blank slate that it gives them a lot of flexibility to craft sort of innovation friendly legislation that is like a competitive advantage when you're competing for businesses and startups. It's really attractive kind of value proposition. And I think there's like, a lot of Western banks are spinning up kind of arms or subsidiaries or kind of spinoffs to basically do trading activities, to do things in digital assets industry with companies registered in either Abu Dhabi or Dubai, and often doing it with partners from Hong Kong. And so you're seeing kind of this, it's like the first mover advantage is very strong. If those companies that have all that legacy experience, often they come from TradFi and then sort of adapt those skills for whether it's market structure, whether it's certain sorts of setting up of broker dealer arrangements or sort of trading infrastructure or capabilities that allow them to basically create first mover advantage in these regulatory sandboxes that have been established in really the Emirates and in Hong Kong and Singapore to a certain extent. And that first mover advantage could become strategically important in the next few years. The U.S. is kind of definitely behind the curve when it comes to that. I mean, we have now the ETFs, of course. We have the legacy Bitcoin mining presence. We have I think a strong sort of foundation. But I think the broader environment is becoming extremely competitive for where the next tranche of those businesses are gonna set up. And I think the larger strategic play for those countries is to try to suck as much talent and capital into their own jurisdictions as possible. I know that the DIFC was created essentially as a clone of the City of London. I think the lawyer who helped them write the kind of like the set up the framework for the DIFC was like one of the sort of top guys in the City of London 20 years ago, and sort of crafted a sort of English law, common law based system sort of to mirror the City of London, so that contracts and legal agreements and disputes and arbitration would essentially be sort of mirror images of the City of London system. Which, if you think about it from you have this sort of legacy node up here that has all these connections to it that would normally give it a lot of stickiness in a global system. Like you have a node that has a lot of other nodes connected to it. It's kind of hard for other nodes to kind of defect from that connection, right? Because there's a lot of sunk cost and sort of inertia, and also just embedded legal and historical connections that make it hard to kind of displace that node from its kind of dominant position. But if you have another node, right? Say the DIFC or ADGM node that are basically almost like clones of kind of have the same connection points, have the same internal structure and sort of legal framework as that node that it's trying to displace, then it's much easier for kind of the legacy connectors to that old node to kind of just create new connections to that new node. And the more those connections kind of get duplicated or even just swapped out, the easier it is for that new node to kind of take over the role that old node used to have. It's easier now for DIFC to kind of take more and more of what the City of London was doing. And that's why I think people, look at Dubai and in England as these geopolitical actors. When I sort of think of them as the sort of nexuses or nexi of law, sort of legal codes, social codes, and capital. And that if that's a convenient marriage of those things that work for the interests of the parties involved, then you actually can have a pretty fast transition of the legacy network structure to a new configuration. And I think that's the risk that we think the legacy system is really sticky, right? That the dollar system is just so sticky because it's embedded in this very complex hierarchical correspondent banking system that sort of organically evolved over the last 75 years. And that there's just a lot of embedded stickiness to all those relationships and all those sort of patterns of corporate financial relationships. I think what you're seeing these emerging isn't an attempt to replicate, that same kind of messy, organically evolved correspondent banking system. What you're seeing is an effort to kind of create a new sort of from scratch, sort of much more like a hub and spoke, but on these digital rails. Sorts of systems that are much easier to kind of create, because you don't really need to do this whole massive, messy, multi-decade long process of correspondent banks that just were sort of going out into the world and doing resource deals and had to do trade finance, and the trade finance turned into more complex kind of dollar finance sort of instruments, and sort of the legacy Western U.S. capital system kind of built on top of that organically. These emerging hubs can kind of like come in at the top and kind of create much more efficient, kind of one-to-many relationships, as long as they have like the legal framework there. And I think that's what you're seeing kind of the play by these Gulf powers in Hong Kong and Singapore to do. Now, whether it succeeds to like take over, right, or whether they just emerge as like alternative key nodes in a global system that are sort of competing on par with the City of London and other offshore centers. So, but that's I think an important feature of their activities that doesn't get a whole lot of attention.
Quick break here, freaks. This rip is brought to you by Gradually Then Suddenly, a framework for understanding Bitcoin as money by Parker Lewis. I wrote the foreword to the book. I'm honored to have done so because it's the best 0-to-1 primer if you're looking for a logical explanation of why Bitcoin obsoletes all other money. Buy one for yourself and maybe a few for your friends. Go to thesafehouse.com/gradually. That's thesafehouse.com, safe spelled SAIF, thesafehouse.com/gradually. Use the promo code TFTC for $5 off at checkout. Buy it now, freaks. The price of Bitcoin is going up. You need to understand it. This is the best 0-to-1 primer. This rip was also brought to you by our good friends at Zaprite. If you're a Bitcoiner and run a business or an independent contractor, you should be accepting Bitcoin as payment. If not you, then who? If we believe that fiat is systemically fragile and is a risk, the rails that currency runs on are a risk as well. You need to begin accepting Bitcoin as soon as possible. Invest in the future of your business. Create a redundant rail by accepting Bitcoin as payment using Zaprite and reduce risk for your business. I've done this for my business. Here at TFTC, we use Zaprite. It allows you to easily create invoices, payment links, or connect e-commerce stores, connect your wallets or custodial accounts, and be set up in minutes. We can also connect our bank accounts, our Stripe accounts, or Square accounts to accept fiat as well. The time is now, freaks. The fiat system is fragile. Invest in the infrastructure that de-risks the future. Invest in yourself. Bitcoin payments with Zaprite. Go to zaprite.com/TFTC to get $40 off their annual subscription. Zaprite.com/TFTC, $40 off.
Competition's good. I think it's safe to say that the U.S., from both the political and financial perspective, has gotten a bit complacent over the last couple decades and obviously gotten out of control, particularly on the monetary, financial, and debt side of things. And it would make sense that if this hyper interconnected system and some of the individual participants within that system notice that the nexus of the system is somewhat rotting at its core, that they would move to create alternatives to secure their interest and their financial well-being. But do you see this as I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Like, is this this should be expected? Like, this is just the way the world works. Opportunities arise. People take advantage of those opportunities. It seems that America, up until recently, I think you said belatedly, has become aware of these facts happening, has been somewhat sleeping at the wheel, but now we're aware of it. And I guess that's my question. Like, what is the reaction? And does it even have to be political? This is where I'm getting, because it does seem like there's an emergence of actors within the private sector, particularly in defense tech, and I would even throw Bitcoin into the financial side of things, that have acutely recognized these problems and are actively working within the private sector to solve some of the defense issues that exist, and on the Bitcoin side, the monetary and financial problems that exist. Like, do you have hope that the private sector could help navigate our way out of this?
Yeah, I think it is one of our sort of historical strengths, right? America's kind of entrepreneurial spirit, our sort of ability to kind of imagine something from scratch and then create, global strategic industries, right? It's been like an historical trump card for American power. Sort of clusters of innovation that really explore and then conquer kind of new frontiers. And so, yeah, I never want to kind of doubt our ability to kind of come back from the brink, right, and really kind of marshal our collective energies to a strategic purpose. And I think you're seeing some of that emerge. Again, it's sometimes shrouded in a bit of hype, and kind of the marketing speak by a lot of the funders involved. But I think there's a core trend underway under the umbrella of what you might call the A16Zs, like American Renaissance, despite how maybe hollow that is to a certain extent, in my view, given that it's mostly Saudi money funding it. But I think in general, like there are a lot of like 20-somethings in the Gundo Valley, a lot of smart aerospace engineers, folks that now have access to capital from whatever sources to pursue pretty interesting ideas. And I think you're seeing a convergence of attention, given, I think, an alignment of interest now that wasn't really in place a few years ago, but is now, I think, pretty firm among certain subsets of like the three core power centers of the US, right? Which essentially is Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and DC, right? Like those are the three power centers really of the US. And you have Dallas, Houston, you've got the energy nexus there, but that's kind of its own OPEC island, right? They're like a mini US, non-OPEC member, right? But in terms of this phenomenon, you're really seeing is the Silicon Valley kind of tech community, subsets of that align with subsets of kind of the Wall Street community that's not entirely compromised by China, and then you have subsets of DC, especially the defense and intelligence community, and some of the political players that are also not compromised by China, kind of reach common cause, where they recognize that regardless of who wins in the presidential election this year, we're going to have a pretty old president that will preside over a very fractious country, will probably not have a whole lot of political capital to deploy in a lame duck presidency. And will preside over a global system that's increasingly under lots of strain and aggressive and proactive challenge by adversaries. And that's an unsettling position for major captains of big tech and emerging strategic technology industries. It's an unsettling position for hedge funds and capital managers that are responsible for trillions of dollars of wealth management, and it's unsettling for folks in the political, defense, and intelligence communities that recognize that this next few years is going to be very strategically destabilizing and very challenging to manage and protect U.S. national security interests. And so there's like a sense that there needs to be kind of like backup plans, or there needs to be like can't just rely on the White House to make good decisions, right? And I think that is precipitating actors, on their own in the private sector, looking to see how they can, kind of collaborate to protect their own interests. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon. We'll see how well that takes shape. The one problem with the private sector is, there's not like a natural orienting function, right? Like they all have their own, narrow competitive interests. And those have traditionally been, easy to exploit by, powers that just want to, buy their technology or somehow diverge the financial interests from the larger strategic common purposes they might otherwise want to support. And so that's an interesting new phenomenon. I think you're also seeing new players in the game, right, that are now pretty sizable, like Anduril and Palantir and SpaceX, that have serious strategic capabilities. Starlink, as was critical to Ukraine's defense. It's probably going to be critical to maintain communication lines in Taiwan if China ever got frisky. It's being seen as U.S. military. They're creating like a separate constellation just for the U.S. military called Starshield. It's going to be highly resilient, capable, sort of low Earth orbit mesh communications for a lot of different strategic purposes. So you can imagine capabilities coming out of these relatively new defense companies, right? Anduril, Palantir for software and AI, Anduril with essentially swarm drones of all different modalities, underwater, surface, airborne, et cetera, that now provide capabilities that are sort of that are not coming out of like the Lockheeds and the Boeings or the Raytheons, and that could be coming out in scale in the next few years. And so that's like a new phenomenon that I think didn't exist before, where you have essentially these Silicon Valley defense tech primes that are being led by individuals that are not from the traditional defense contracting community, right? Like Elon and Palmer Luckey and Alex Karp, the Peter Thiel types. These guys are not, your typical, Lockheed executive, right? And that's a new dynamic that, we'll see how that plays out. But and it's potentially different because there's a lot of like literal chips on the line, right? You've got trillions of dollars of Western equity that is now like an inverted pyramid resting on the stability of the Taiwan situation. And so that generates a lot of anxiety, right, among those investors that have, literally trillions of dollars in paper gains on a certain configuration of technology and capital. That could be vulnerable if one man, President Xi, decides to take a gamble in the next few years. And so that's an interesting position for the globe to find itself in, where we've never been like richer than we've ever been. We've never had as much like technological possibilities laying out before us with the explosive growth of AI, and yet we've never had this sense of such acute vulnerability and fragility. And I think that combination is likely to sort of lead to different sorts of reactions and arrangements of how you think about securing strategic interests that we haven't seen before. It could almost go back to like a more kind of pre-Westphalian state of things, right? Like the concept of Westphalian sovereignty was predicated on kind of a very much like a pure physical geography, right? You use standing armies that invade and conquer, subject neighboring populations, extract the resources, et cetera. The sort of global environment we're seeing right now, you see like a mix of those old traditional like types of wars like in Eastern Europe, which are just like land grabs for resources and strategic depth. But I think globally, the U.S.-China competition is not really a competition about that to first order. It's a competition over these global networks, right? Global trade, global digital and financial clearing systems, and then these emerging networks of value and energy that are essentially going to be embedded on top of AI and increasingly Bitcoin as well. So I think that's a fascinating new development. It changes sort of the pattern of what we think competition will look like. And it's going to unfold, I think, in ways that we don't have a whole lot of like historical templates for.
Yeah, when you frame it as we've never been as wealthy as we are as a society globally, yet probably never as fragile either, it just makes my mind go immediately to Fermi's paradox. Like, we're not going to break through the filter. Like,
well, yeah. I mean, we're seeing a lot of things kind of converge in this decade, and I don't know if it's just, what do you call that? Like pareidolia, where you just see patterns where you're just, where it's really just noise. But if you look at like you're seeing a rise in all these different domains of usually like an obsession over some near future event or precipitating kind of crisis that we're sort of we're heading towards and we can't avoid, right? And in the traditional geopolitical space, you see this as China's Taiwan invasion. That's like anchoring kind of like inflection, almost like event horizon. It's like we're either converging towards it and everything after that will be fundamentally unknowable and most likely destructive. But like that's like the anchoring point is the China-Taiwan invasion in geopolitics. In the financial space, it's another financial collapse. It's runaway hyperinflation with dollar debts reaching like a critical inflection point. So there's a strain of folks in sort of like the FinTwit space to look out over the next 5 or 10 years and see like it's a very fragile system. Eventually we'll have to do yield curve control, and that'll precipitate like a loss of faith, and there'll be capital controls, and we'll effectively have to wipe out most treasury debt. And so that's like the anchoring future event that we're sort of building towards. It's a big crisis, and everything after that nothing will be the same. And Bitcoin is sort of is like a outgrowth of that, but has its own kind of future event, which is some version of either hyper Bitcoinization or some inflection growth of the price of Bitcoin, global adoption, nation states competing, that there's like going to be some event or some triggering phase transition that after which everything will be different, right? And I see same with AI, that we're increasingly serious prognosticators say that at their current level of sort of exponential growth, about 5x per year, or doubling time of about every 6 months, in terms of like the total amount of compute we're using to train sort of frontier models, that by 2027, 2028, we could automate sort of AI researchers. And once we automate AI researchers, then we maybe hit like this sort of sort of bootstrapping feedback loop where you get like an intelligence explosion and you get something past AGI. And so the same thing with like the UAP conversation that we've talked about, right? There's like a sense that in the next few years, there could be some disclosure of some, other piece of information that is, heretofore not been widely recognized by most of society, that after which everything will be different. So I see like across all these radically different domains, there's like a similar psychological orientation towards a highly disruptive, phase transition, event, crisis in the next few years. And I think human beings are very much like prone to like, catastrophism, prone to like almost apocalyptic styles of thinking. And it tends to make the world a bit cleaner to think about, because if you think there's just going to be one big event that you have to prepare for and you have the inside straight for it, and that, after that, everything that you've been saying will be proven right? So for the folks that are like the China bears that are just like nonstop beating the war drum, they'll be proven right. For the Bitcoin, kind of bulls, it'd be like, hyper-Bitcoinization, I told you so. For the pro UAP disclosure people, be like, you know what, I told you so. For the AGI people, be like, yep, it's like we're all going to be, uploading our brains to the cloud, and we're going to like, dominate the future light cone of human civilization. And they were the ones kind of at the front, at sort of the vanguard of that. So there's a lot of this sort of thinking I see across all these different domains. And they all sort of peg their like window for whatever that event is towards like the latter half of this decade, right? 2027, 2028, 2029. And I don't know what to make of that other than maybe it's a feature of our collective thinking now that after COVID and Russia, that everything kind of became very unstable, very unsettled. And we've just been, we're all just now looking in whatever our domain of interest is, looking for like the next big event that's going to be like the one we just went through, right? And then we've all been psychologically conditioned from COVID that maybe some of us didn't feel prepared for it. Then now we're like overreacting, and we're like, okay, we need to prepare for the next big thing that's going to break the world system, right? I tend to think that all those things have like a plausibility to them, but I also tend to think that the world never just ends or goes through like a radical just like black hole and event horizon. Like it always looks like that from the standpoint of history, but when you're going through it, it's just like a messy evolution, and it's a transition to some other configuration that makes sense once you get there. And it's never like the end of the world. It's never like an apocalypse. It's just different. And there's a logic to how you got there that, from our standpoint now would look like a radical jump or transition. But also humanity's gone through many, many of those before, right? Of various kinds, whether it's plagues and, massive natural disasters, world wars, massive industrial transformations. So I think it's not like a new thing. So that's like my baseline expectations. It'll be like the ones we saw before. But it could, still be disruptive. It's just not going to be, the end of all things or the great redemptive moment for your particular obsession. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
No, I love that rant. It aligns perfectly with the sovereign individual thesis that was put forth in that book. It's essentially that we've found ourselves at this 500-year super cycle inflection point, and these inflection points are typically extremely chaotic in many different domains, politically, monetarily, technologically. And I think that's what we have to fall back on. And then, of course, the social media age just accentuates all of this, as you can communicate globally instantly, and not only communicate, but observe and absorb information as it's being put out into the ether. Not to the ether, but put out into the internet on a second-by-second basis.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, this is the challenge I think the Western liberal democracies are going to face is democracy is sort of it's easy for a power elite to accept when economic conditions are somewhat stable and positive. I mean, that sort of is like, there's like a social contract. There's a sort of an implicit trade of sort of freedom of movement, freedom of decisions, freedom of speech, et cetera, that can be accommodated by an economic system allied to a political system that kind of rising tide lifts all boats. And that was kind of America in the post-war era. We obviously hit some snags in the 70s, but I think overall we've had this sense that, the arrangement between liberal democracy and now techno-capitalism is starting to diverge, right? And that's a major challenge, because I think you're seeing this kind of manifest in different ways by folks that wouldn't traditionally you wouldn't think would be aligned politically, right? Like there's some folks that in sort of like the AGI, like AI lab space, that fundamentally think the risk is so high of like a runaway AI intelligence explosion that we effectively need, what would amount to like maybe benign global totalitarian control over computing, right? That we need to have on-chip surveillance of every compute load that's run in every data center around the world. And to do that, we need to have agreements in place with all the major great powers, including China and Russia, as like the overriding, almost like a supervening, civilizational prerogative, that we need to now surveil all computing in order to prevent the emergence of this, existential intelligence explosion, AGI. Like there's serious people who believe this, and they're not necessarily making it their main policy program, but that it's sort of in the logical end state. Essentially, they need to then construct and need to lobby for a political arrangement that is effectively digital totalitarianism, right? There needs to be complete surveillance and control over the computational substrate of civilization that's going to emerge in the next 5 or 10 years. And it's maybe well motivated. It's motivated from probably folks that 5, 10 years ago would be like Bernie voters, like very progressives, like very much like anti-big Wall Street, anti-banks, probably hate, sort of what they see as like sort of neo-fascist sort of MAGAs. But in their mind, there's this new threat out there that some of them might be creating in their minds, but that it will require a policy framework that is effectively digital totalitarianism. And of course, China would love to hear that. Like that's music to their ears, right? And I think this starts off on the fringes now, but I think people might call me a bit histrionic, but I think this will become one of the defining political debates. And it's downstream of what you just mentioned in terms of like social media conversation, broader freedom of speech, the broader sort of social contract of Western liberal democracies in an era that's defined by intense geopolitical competition between different systems of government and power, U.S., China, particularly kind of a liberal Oceania versus kind of autocratic Eurasia, as well as different technological systems, right? That are increasingly going to be like a stack of, sort of energy inputs, computing, and then APIs and sort of transaction relationships, and increasingly like AI agents and systems of relationships that human beings and their beliefs and transactions are embedded in. And so you can imagine it's like society in that construct, like human society is a relatively thin layer that's embedded in this really complex, geographically mediated energy and computational substrate. And so the sort of political principles that define, whether you can buy and sell energy, in a free market, and whether you can run compute loads without, government surveillance, or like a choke point, sort of kill switch involved. Those are gonna be like defining political debates that will inherently determine what sort of space of operating freedom society has, right? Because it's no longer, can I go plant a garden? That's the space of freedom that I think of, like 19th century, Jeffersonian democracy. Like the space of freedom is, can I say the thing I want to say to someone else on the internet? Can I buy the thing that I want to buy? Can I pay using the thing I want to pay with? Can I consume the amount of energy I want to consume? Can I drive the kind of car that I want to kind of drive, where I want to drive it, right? Like this sort of traditional space of freedom that we have for our daily life will all be essentially digitally mediated. And so to the extent of those digital systems that we live in and transact through are embodied in essentially a digital totalitarian oriented system or a liberal democratic oriented digital system, those are really like the fundamental like choice point for, the Western liberal democracies in the next few years. Like whether we decide to beat China, we basically need to become like China, just like our version of that kind of techno-authoritarian system, or whether we find an alternative model that is still compatible with the technological path we're on, as well as our historical commitments to liberal democracy. So that's I think where the stakes are. And it's not encouraging to me to see, our leading venture capitalists essentially make common cause with, the MBSs of the world, where, I think it was Ben Horowitz from Andreessen Horowitz, who just raised $40 billion from the Saudis to invest in AI. And the argument he gave was kind of this torture justification. And they're very much on, at least nominally, on the side of like open sourcing technology, open sourcing AI. They're very much against the kind of closed Microsoft, kind of vision where it's like all proprietary black boxes you have to sort of pay rent to, sort of as like serfs on their digital land. Their vision is it's like open source, competitive, free market, proliferating ecosystem, which sounds great, except, the nominal justification was for open source was that we need to create open source, AI models so that, governments like the Saudis can adapt those models for their own political conditions. And he said, we don't want, MBS to lose power because an AI model, was proliferated and, led to like an unmanageable spread of, radical Islamic belief inside the kingdom and led to the collapse of the ruling elite. And so we need, as like the West, to create these technologies that help basically keep, autocrat dictators in power. And that seems a bit, I mean, you can believe that, but I would say argue for that, not just say like, I'm for freedom technology, therefore we need to have open source AI to keep, Mohammed bin Salman, ruler of Saudi Arabia because he gives us $40 billion, right? That seems a bit self-interested. So I think that's the concerning part, is that, if we're facing this choice point between two sort of, paths in terms of how we build society in these digital systems, or based on these digital systems, and the money that's being used to fund the development of those digital systems essentially coming from autocrats, and those autocrats want to leverage those systems for their own, personal economic benefit, as well as their political, the stability of their political rule. Well, that doesn't mean that probably is likely mean we're not going to tip into the better part of that path, right? That makes it more likely we're going to tip into this more dystopian path, and that's a concern. And I see this sort of play out on sort of the geopolitical side, where, if you read the articles about like the Microsoft G42 deal, G42 is this Emirati AI tech conglomerate, very much like a national champion of the Emirati state, and the ruling elite. We have been aggressively trying to pull them out of China's orbit into U.S. orbit. Secretary Raimondo even said, that like this Microsoft G42 deal was essentially a win for bringing G42 kind of into the U.S. camp, and that you could only be in the China camp or the U.S. camp. And that seems like a short-term geopolitical point score, at least to a certain extent. Maybe there's caveats to even that, given the nature of the deal, and how its sort of phase 2 implementation might go, and the security controls for those AI models and everything else. But in general, though, the relationship the way we frame that relationship is like, we need to influence the Emiratis to sort of come over to our side, meaning the U.S. freedom, good liberal democracy side, and away from the China side, the bad digital totalitarians side. But I feel like that's like maybe like a Pyrrhic victory if in doing so we've effectively had to compromise all of our values along the way, and we're effectively now committing to an arrangement of technology capital that steers the path of these digital systems down a path that's not that doesn't respect individual liberty, right? And I think that's a concern, right? But that's not at the top of the policy space, right? The policy conversation is just beat China, right? It's just okay. It's just they got to be in our camp versus their camp. It's not like a competition over value systems. It's not a competition over conceptions of a political order in a digital society. It's just it should be our spyware, not Chinese spyware. It should be our surveillance, not Chinese surveillance, right? And it's like, well, that's not exactly a very attractive proposition. To I think go out into the world and say, oh, okay, yeah, don't install the Chinese Huawei 5G, and with the ZTE surveillance systems built on top of it, and the choke pointable, digital yuan, and the M-Bridge sort of, state to state kind of extraction system for digital clearing. Like, just don't do that. That's the bad digital totalitarian stack that China is trying to roll out around the world. We don't really have an alternative model that's right now aligned to our political beliefs, at least our liberal, the liberal side of those political beliefs, except for, I would argue, Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins that are sort of in the private sphere, where those are digital systems that I think are much more closely aligned to that Jeffersonian conception, right? And so if there is this, that's why I think Bitcoin is very important. As these systems start to take shape, the role of Bitcoin, at least to the extent that it can maintain that orientation, is going to be very important in kind of keeping that balance between the temptations of digital surveillance and totalitarianism from tipping too far. Again, another rant.
Well, I love your rants. Comment and then question. Comment. I think the visualization description of the substrated layer of energy compute and human social layer is the clearest depiction of the potential dystopian digital future that lays before us in one path. So kudos to that. I think anybody who didn't pay attention during that part, go back and listen to it. I think it is, in terms of describing the mechanics that would lead to that dystopian future, it is the clearest, most succinct description I've ever heard on this show, at least. And then question, like, what would your solution all like if you had, I know magic wands don't exist. Mm-hmm. But what would the advice to the people putting forth policy in DC, what advice would you give them? How would you set up an environment to compete with everything you just described?
Yeah, I think it has to start well with good leadership and a clear sense of what the stakes are. Like, what are we fighting for? Are we just fighting for Microsoft's market share? Are we just fighting for kind of short-term, interests of our venture capital and private equity ecosystem? That seems to be what has led us down sort of a, maybe a dead-end strategic or strategic road. Is we haven't clearly articulated what we're fighting for, and therefore what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, right? And what trade-offs are we willing to make, right, as a society? And fundamentally, this might be the part that inevitably we're not prepared to accept certain amounts of costs, right? Like, we're not prepared to allow, we're not prepared to block, say, Saudi and Emirati money into our venture capital system, right? Like, because our major political class relies on the donors from venture capital and private equity, businesses, and we just don't have the capacity to say no, right? So if I say ignore those political constraints, the political economy of the U.S. System, given how vulnerable it is to essentially big donor capture, I think the biggest important thing is just to say, like, what's a vision of the future we're trying to build towards, right? And I think ironically, our adversaries have done a much better job of laying out like long-term strategic plans. Like, China has like a 2020 has a 2035 long-term plan. Saudi Arabia has Vision 2030. Emirates has Vision 2031. They have defined for their country, for their nation, where they want to go in the next 5-10 years. Like, this is the strategic, plausible near-term, point that we want to aim for. This is what this is going to mean. These are the areas we're going to prioritize, and this is how we're going to do it. Now, in messy democracies that operate on 4-year cycles, that's very hard to do. But I think this really comes down to strong leadership. If you come out the gate and you say, yes, there's 500 things on the plate of the president and leadership of the national leadership at any given moment, but here's a national plan for the next 10 years. Here's what we're going to do. And it isn't going to be the federal government's job to manage all of those. It's going to be, here's what we think collectively. This is our strategic advantage. This is how we preserve democracy in the next 10 years. And this is the transformations we're going to undergo. We recognize that, all these different aspects of our society are going to be strained by these emerging technologies. But here's a clear vision for what success looks like. And then you sort of give those marching orders to the political class and say, here's the sets of initiatives that we think are going to, marshal collective, like a collective alignment of narrow self-interest, right? I think it's going to be hard to sort of do that, but I think that's how you would start. I think the biggest thing, and this is the problem I see with, like these like we're all like any given policy instrument is often well justified in the moment, like narrowly justified, but it's symptomatic of a strategic failure, right? So like the electric vehicle tariffs, right, that we imposed on Chinese EVs and also a whole swath of other sort of Chinese imports. Like I think the argument for them may be sound now, but the fact that we have to do them is evidence that we strategically failed. Right. Like we totally didn't recognize this was going to be a strategic industry. We didn't feel like we could overcome the legacy power of the big three, big four autos, and we sort of snubbed Tesla, from all those from like the political sort of benefits that we gave to those other autos. So I think that's where we are now, is we have to basically fight these rearguard actions. So it's kind of hard to overcome the weight of those historical failures and just sort of all of a sudden have a magic bullet to clean things up. I think it's gonna be if I had to like really step back and say this is like the most important thing to do. I would say, and this might sound a bit trite, but like there are decisions that are going to be made in the next 1 to 2 years, maybe soon, maybe sooner, depending on how quickly these different arrangements come into play, of where the next where a 10 gigawatt data center to train the next frontier model is going to be, right? And so right now we're training, I think about less than 1 gigawatt in our biggest ones. I think the Stargate one with Microsoft is about $100 billion data center in Missouri. I think it's in Missouri. But then so this big question of like, if it's true that we're going to generate something like AGI, and now I mean like Terminator, take over the planet, extinguish humanity, like AI. I just mean like a computational system that can perform, almost every human cognitive task, and with robots can perform most human labor tasks in the next, 3 to 5 years. If we're going to create that, and it seems plausible, maybe not guaranteed that we will, but if it's plausible that someone's going to create that, I think it's very important that gets created, inside the United States, and not in, the Middle East or not in China. And that's important. And if it does get created in an alternative jurisdiction, then, there's a whole host of other considerations that have to go in behind that. Because I think that will accrue a huge amount of strategic and economic advantage to the jurisdiction in which that model is trained, and over whose sort of power, and under whose power that system is being run. Because if it's aligned to an autocrat system, it's maybe not great. But if it's aligned to a Democrat liberal system, maybe it's at least you get a fighting chance. So that I think, I mean, it sounds a bit more sci-fi-ish, but I think it won't be so sci-fi in the next year or two. These sorts of discussions will now, I think, become much more politically salient. I think they're happening now. I know that there are folks inside the defense intelligence community that are very, very interested in that set of decisions. And so, it sounds like a very narrow, very sort of sci-fi thing, is like where that 10 gigawatt data center, where those chips are going to be fabbed, where the next nuclear power plants are going to be built. And if you look at the Emirates, and this is all public now, is like the Emirates is freely, they're going, and the Emirates and the Saudis are going all in on basically this nexus of AI and nuclear energy. And they see it as like this strategic technology unlock that, because they have so much capital they can pour into it, they can sort of, reposition themselves in the global competition, really up-level their status as geopolitical actors, not just petrostates, but actually have, captured and transformed themselves into, critical nodes in this emerging technological sort of network. And so that's I think going to be the front lines. And the Emirates, I think, are currently in the lead. The Saudis are trying to catch up. But, if we wake up in 10 years or less, and it turns out that, the Emirates has managed to basically transform hundreds of billions of dollars of dollar capital into the construction of new nuclear power plants, maybe even getting prototype fusion built in their country, because they'll cut all the red tape. They've been able to induce TSMC to set up next gen fabs in their country, churning out AI specific chips that are co-located next to those fission and fusion, power plants that are also right next to the big data centers that are going to house those chips. And imagine a scenario where those data centers are now hosting AI models that are, effectively designing the next generation of AI chips. Because I heard someone from OpenAI said this publicly, that they expect the models in 2 years to be better at designing AI chips than their best AI chip designers now. So that gives you a position where a country like the Emirates can basically design, have AI models that are designing the best AI chips that are then fabbed in the Emirates, that are going into the data centers, that are designing the next generation, that are et cetera. So you see that feedback loop can be quite powerful. And that is a decision that's probably going to get made soon in terms of where those deals are going to get done and who's going to buy and where that infrastructure is going to be set up. And for the United States to really get out of its own way and make sure that we're the place where we build those systems. It's going to require a pretty dramatic transformation of our political system because our grid probably can't take that amount of growth. We don't have the bureaucratic and political will right now to cut all the red tape, fast track approvals of nuclear power, et cetera, to sort of keep up with that growth. And so, it's there's sort of an energy and jurisdictional gradient that is pulling a lot of these emerging critical technologies into the Middle East, into the Emirates and the Saudis in particular. And it's concerning to me that could be a backdoor also for China, right? Because right now, the Emirates is playing nice with the US, being very friendly, because they need to basically get this marriage done to be able to secure this, access to these strategic technologies. Once they have it, though, once they've got this infrastructure built in the next 5 or 10 years, there's nothing that that makes it likely that strategic alignment to the U.S. is going to endure. I don't see why it would. And instead, they've just basically harvested a lot of the gains they needed in the short term to position themselves, and then they could parlay that back to the Chinese for whatever inducements or deals that the Chinese would offer them. So that's I think where, if there's a new great game happening, the new digital great game, we have to recognize we're playing that new digital great game, not try to score short-term political points for our political aspirations. If you're, say, Secretary Raimondo and you want to have a big win, but think about the long game. Think about what the second and third order effects of these arrangements are going to mean for U.S. strategic positioning in these critical technologies, and learn to take short-term trade-offs to mitigate those long-term costs. And I don't see that happening now. So the first thing is just don't make dumb decisions. Don't make the short-term kind of trade-off. Easier said than done, as I think everyone knows. That's the first step, is just think long term. I think that's the lesson of Bitcoin, is long term thinking. Don't have short time preference. You usually make better strategic decisions if you just have that simple premise. But I think everything in our current political context and the exigencies of the geopolitical contest sort of force our attentions very narrowly on just winning every tactical battle and mitigating a political enemy that might be trying to exploit the moment. And that's led us down this road where now we're having to sort of play on the back foot in many ways.
Lovely. Yeah, it's not great, especially when you consider the hyper polarized political situation here in the United States. And it's not encouraging that we have an election upcoming between two 80-plus-year-olds, one of which is completely dementia-ridden. Yeah. And then you got me somewhat speechless here as I'm processing all this.
No, this is why it is kind of a danger zone for the next 4 years. It's we kind of have to we kind of have to get our ish together pretty soon.
And with all that being said, what I just mentioned, it seems like it has to be driven by the private sector. People in the private sector. You said that leader, that vision that needs to be put forth. I think American citizens need to recognize, again, the hyper polarized atmosphere that exists in DC right now. Work to not be put into the frame that they want to put you in, which is blue versus red. Always hate the other. Because that's the other thing domestically, like at the social layer, people are just so distracted by bullshit. And it's really trying to figure out like how to shake people out of that framing and that polarization and recognize, hey, we've got some big problems ahead of us that need to be solved. And I think we do need the private sector to lead the way, leaders in the private sector to come out and put these narratives forward. And it's funny, going back to like Silicon Valley environment, it's like one of the big headlines of the last couple of weeks is like David Sachs, Chamath, hosting a fundraising event for Trump in San Francisco. And it seems that even some of the people who would be deemed to be competent private sector actors are still convinced that you need to play this political game. And who knows, maybe Trump gets in this time around, he's got a vendetta and is on the war path to completely hollow out the swamp, if you will, based on his first term. I'm not going to hold my breath for that, but I guess if you're going to go the political route, that's what you have to hope will happen, is something like that. But outside of that, it's going to be dependent on the private sector, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think people always, Trump is just one manifestation of this recurring American belief that it's just one great man will come in and fix all of our problems. And that's fundamentally like, it's a symptom of broader laziness that like, oh, I just donate some money or I go to a rally and therefore like the bad people are going to lose, right? From my standpoint. And it's much more nuanced, much more like institutions don't get built by one person, right? They can be destroyed by one person, but like the work of creative, progressive in like the neutral progressive sense is creating new institutions, is actually working collaboratively in a peer-to-peer manner to create something new, right? It isn't just a destructive, oh, I'm gonna like, get revenge on my political enemies, or I'm gonna like, clear out the BS in DC, et cetera, right? The typical kind of conceits on the campaign trail. It's much more difficult. It's much more looks like what Bitcoin is, which is like a peer-to-peer system, is sort of a novel institution that isn't led by one man, isn't subject to one man's, foibles or obsessions. It is a collective project that is aligned with, individual incentives, sort of engineered from the beginning to maximize kind of collective consensus, but doesn't require kind of a traditional democratic agreement, but helps sort of form an anchor point for individual action that in the aggregate, I think, looks like a novel form of an institution, right? And I mean, all human institutions are essentially social fictions, patterns of collective belief that are sustained and accrete, reality over time. And those are then, formalized or codified, whether it's in technical code, physical infrastructure, capital investments, and then patterns of belief that sort of reinforce each other over time. That's like all that human civilization is, right? And I think that's an important, proof of what Bitcoin has done, is it sort of turned from what was just like a project into like a novel human institution that has global scale, but that is sort of orthogonal to the traditional sort of human and political institutions that we're used to interacting with. So I think there is a model there that can be looked to as an example of how to, go back to like the early era of when de Tocqueville was touring America. He sort of was remarking on how sort of the civic fabric of American society was really stitched together by different, smaller scale, sort of individual social groups, right? Whether it was church functions or sort of civil groups of various kinds, different neighborhood societies. In the modern era, it's like kids' soccer teams and sort of the school board, et cetera. And I think that's where like small d democracy like thrives. And it's like, it's messy, but I think that's the part that makes America like endure through, all sorts of political volatility at the national level, is because people have a sense of trust in fealty to their neighbors and their local groups. The dangerous thing that I see is like when you nationalize everything down to the local level, right? Like the thing that I think is very dangerous and toxic about American politics now is that everything is now sort of infected by the national political discourse, right? Like you can't. The reason why, I mean, again, like it's a podcast, right? But I think that the all-in guys, again, they're a bunch of sort of rich elites that dump their bags like Solana on people, right? So I wouldn't necessarily they're of moral pure hearts, and I think their alignment behind Trump may be one politically motivated, but also just motivated of self-interest, right? Like he'll give them tax breaks and whatever. But I think it also it reflects the sense that they also disagree with each other politically, but they're friends, and I think that's an important difference that's like hard to maintain in a current political context where everyone has to pick a tribe, and that can even like cleave down to your neighbors, right? I think that's very unhealthy for democracy to be polarized, down to like that atomic level. So yeah, I don't have a cure for that. I do think though that like because people just don't want to play the game anymore, they're sort of trying to find alternative channels for collective action. And if you're a technologist, that involves thinking about hard problems to build. And it sort of doesn't necessarily require, getting the thumbs up from your political team, right? And that's encouraging, right? It's like that's what I think a lot of the sort of American Renaissance, non-trademarked version manifests as. And yeah, I think that's one plank of hope for the U.S. Like we do have like people that will just go out and just do stuff together, and that stuff turns out to be quite important. And it's like, okay, well, I don't necessarily want to count us out because that's the one thing China really doesn't have. They all respond to top-down political mandate to a certain extent. I mean, there's a lot of very smart, very capable entrepreneurs, and they've invested a lot in these technology ecosystems, and these industries just have a scale and efficiency that is quite impressive, and if not intimidating from a U.S. strategic perspective. But in terms of getting like the right mix of entrepreneurial talent and idea generation to actually build something novel and have like kind of a fertile ground to go out and do the thing, the U.S. still is the only place that you can really do that. And so as long as we kind of have that and sort of expand that, I think we'll keep winning, or we'll win more than we're losing. I would say. But yeah, it's gonna be a challenge, right? So when you say the private sector, I think this is the interesting phenomenon that is also changing, right? Because there's the small private sector, like folks like you, right? Entrepreneurs building a business, sort of carving out a niche on their own. But there's also like a new type of private sector actor, or maybe a new flavor of an old type of private sector actor that is taking shape in these new markets that have traditionally been state dominated, right? And I think what you can look at the world, my view of the world system right now isn't necessarily one dominated by just states going at interacting with each other in a traditional kind of realist framework of states competing over resources and prestige, et cetera. What you see now, you essentially have private companies, multinationals, that don't have like a national identity. They don't have they have headquarters in one place. For tax purposes, they have different headquarters, different sort of R&D centers, staffing centers. Like they've distributed their operations across the world to optimize for the local talent, the local jurisdictions, the tax benefits, et cetera, right? And so when you see a company, you're like, oh, Google or, Microsoft or, Apple, it's like, well, what is that? Like, those are like novel entities that are like supranational in scale that don't necessarily have like loyalty or strategic alignment to any one country, right? They kind of play across many different countries. And actually, I was at an event last year with Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines was remarking on this in a very, say, disjointed fashion when she was describing how the intelligence community is having a difficult time adjusting to this new sort of pattern, which is they have to think about the plans and capabilities of non-state actors at the same level that they have to think about the plans and capabilities of state actors. Like the traditional function of an intelligence service is to, study your adversaries, study other countries, figure out what they're planning to do and, what they can do, what their military capabilities, economic capabilities, et cetera. And now she was saying they have, entities now on the global stage that rival states in terms of their geopolitical importance and their power. And that changes how the private sector can truly change things. Like you can have individuals now in positions of corporate leadership that are functioning almost as like quasi-sovereigns, right? Like Elon is a great example of this. And there's going to be, and I think you're seeing this take place in these emerging technology sectors like AI and space in particular, where the U.S. government either, in the case of AI, kind of lost the ball, at least on domestic R&D, or at least, national R&D. And these labs just kind of figured out lightning in the bottle with transformer architecture and figured out scaling laws in 2017. And then 2020 kind of hit an inflection point. And now they're trying to catch up. But in space, space has been pretty much a state-dominated frontier since the Cold War, right? It was just U.S. and Soviets and then the Chinese and a handful of other countries, throwing up some satellites. And now is like an intense commercial imperative to like develop, all different parts of the space economy. And so you're having private sector actors now develop capabilities that, just a few years ago were seen as like strategic capabilities in space, but are just being driven by the private market incentives. And I think that what that's going to mean is that in a few years, it could go in a number of different ways, but it means a sort of division of power between the state and non-state is shifting pretty dramatically. And this, traditional legacy dominating state bureaucracies like the U.S. defense departments and intelligence communities are having a hard time adapting to that new regime. And it's hard enough for them, for example, with like space. Like there's a lot of companies now that are developing like on orbit servicing sort of mini satellites that can sort of go up to another satellite, repair it, potentially, refuel it, swap out a module that's been designed to be swapped in. That activity of like on orbit servicing is like identical to what US, China, and Russia have been developing as like anti-satellite destructive capabilities, where you send a little follower satellite up to a adversary satellite. You either get close to it enough to fry it, or you engage with it and you sort of push it up to a bad orbit. And so it's really messing with our whole concept of like strategic deterrence and defense in space, where private sector actors have these capabilities now that we used to think of as like our most highly classified kind of like, strategic capabilities. And you're seeing that now proliferate in all sorts of different domains. And that makes it in general, like much harder and in my sense, like much more unstable. Because you don't have like emerging norms that sort of define what sorts of behavior is safe or not safe. And you have a competitive race to kind of get advantage over one another. And the thing about the private sector, commercial sector is like, well, everyone will say, yeah, one team, one fight, America, great, thumbs up. At the end of the day, like they're commercially motivated, right? They want to maximize profit, right? So they want to beat their competitors, not necessarily beat China. If China's a competitor, they want to beat China, but that's a different thing, right? And so that's going to be the interesting balancing act to try to play the next few years, which is to what extent that people aren't just like paying lip service to this idea of, deep tech for America. That sounds great when you're a small startup and you want to get the defense innovation unit to fund you. You want to get that small business grant. You want to get that venture capitalist who's aligned with the defense intelligence communities to give you the seed round, right? But as you build a product that has to scale, become commercially viable, right? Those people that invested the money, especially the venture capitalists, many of whom might be Saudi, LPs or Emirati LPs, right? They may have other interests in mind. And so that's where I think if I'm someone in the private sector, I want to be clear-eyed about how changing incentives can dilute that like original strategic purpose. And the United States in many of these different areas is trying its best to like, align these companies to its strategic purposes, but they're sort of outside of its control in many ways. Like Microsoft is like, it's almost like its own non-state digital sovereign, right? It's kind of like bullying the government, like the U.S. government around in many ways. It's like it has pretty predatory practices, even on the U.S. government. And the U.S. government is like trying to find ways of corralling it, trying to bring it to heel in many ways, and it's resisting it. And you're seeing that dynamic play out, which is like it's a challenge to kind of traditional notions of Western sovereignty. But yeah, we're in a fascinating new era. Like, for example, Microsoft at the start of the Ukraine war basically took all of Ukraine's government data and moved it to cloud servers based in the UK on their Azure cloud. And so they've effectively like teleported the Ukrainian government, like put it, in like digital government in exile, essentially, teleported to Great Britain for safety, right? So it wouldn't be blown up by a cruise missile, et cetera. And that's like a fundamental change in how we think about sovereignty, right? Like the Ukrainian government, to the extent, like, what is the government, right? The government has all the data on its citizens, has all the tax information, provides social services, disability payments, has registration for this for the draft, yada yada yada. Well, if all those systems and services are now essentially hosted by a private company outside of your territory, like, okay, like sovereignty is not a binary, but like it's on a spectrum. Like that element of your sovereignty has now essentially been sort of eroded, right? And you're seeing this great game play out, like the G42 Microsoft deal case study in Kenya. They did a $1 billion investment in Kenya with G42 to basically build a big data center, fiber optic connections, AI training, et cetera, is all going to be connected like a hydroelectric plant for power, green energy, et cetera. But the key condition of the deal was essentially the Kenyan government would move all of its data and services to that data center, and then they would also encourage, maybe coerce, who knows, like much of the private sector, big companies in Kenya to also host their services and their data on that same cloud infrastructure. So if you think about it from like a digital colonization perspective, it's like right now Kenya has their own different disaggregated networks, on-premise servers, et cetera. And the big Microsoft data centers coming in, and it's just like sucking in all these different locally disaggregated nodes, and are now connected to their one super node. And then that super node, or that local, say national node, is connected to their super node in the Emirates. And the Emirates has a strategic relationship with Kenya, and that's how Microsoft kind of got in. So the Microsoft G42 deal helped Microsoft kind of get into Kenya and work with G42 to set up this big data center build out. And that's, I think, the new pattern you're seeing. It's sort of invisible. It's like digital sovereignty, but with a colonial twist, like a sort of a neo-feudal sort of techno twist, right? Where now it's like, okay, whose digital land are you effectively paying? Are you living on, and who are you paying rent to, right? And it used to be individuals and companies, and now it's governments, right? And so that's, I think, where we're seeing this tension now. Is like governments are now waking up to the fact that their existence as sovereign entities is now effectively mediated and dependent on these big tech giants, right? And that's an uneasy relationship between a traditional source of like national authority and power, and now this emergent private sector, authority and power. And the biggest difference is those private sector, powers don't necessarily have the same interests as the national authorities do, right? So Microsoft, they want America to succeed. I'm sure Brad Smith's a great guy, very patriotic American, but his job is to like get Microsoft data centers, in more places around the world. And if he has to tell the story that's good for America, then he'll tell that story. But fundamentally, his first order is to get more Microsoft data centers. And if that means working with the Emirates and G42 to put those data centers in Kenya, then that's what he's going to do. And so that's the pattern you're seeing now, is like this kind of digital colonial. You could call it colonialism, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing for the countries involved. Like they're getting much more services, they're getting access to frontier AI models, but there's an implicit trade between the inherent sovereignty that was embedded in this disaggregated network of data centers and on-prem services that were maybe less efficient, but now they're going to be dependent on a foreign service provider, global cloud service provider, for their basic economic and governance functions. And that leads to a lot of economic benefits, I'm sure, and efficiencies at scale. But it also implies a trade-off of sovereignty. I mean, you're seeing this kind of like lip service being paid to digital sovereignty, where they have to like put rules around our data has to remain in the country, and you can't train any other models on it, et cetera, et cetera. I suspect those will be, I'm sure those will be loopholes found in all of that, because the imperative for these big tech conglomerates to basically suck up as much data as possible around the world to train, the biggest models, will override sort of the national imperatives to protect their citizens and companies' data. But that's going to be the battle lines, this sort of digital sovereignty as a new play on whether it's digital individual sovereignty or digital national sovereignty, and how much of this is, the power, accrues to the sort of the top of that pyramid, whoever controls that fundamental substrate, or whether it sort of has some countervailing force that keeps it somewhat disaggregated and decentralized.
Damn. It's a brave new world. Again, come back to the sovereign individual predicted all of this. But yeah, I think it's important to fall back to what you were describing earlier, which is recognize that we're in this extremely chaotic transitionary period and try not to become overwhelmed. For the individuals listening out of this, take care of what you can take care of, control what you can control. I think bringing this back to the American perspective moving forward and tying Bitcoin into it, I actually, after almost 2 hours talking about this, have become more thoroughly convinced that Bitcoin is probably the most strategic tool that we can use at this current moment because of the properties that it enables and the power that it gives individuals and companies and states and federal government to a certain extent if it decides to leverage it. But the fact that Americans on a per capita basis own the most Bitcoin. And so if you're looking at the landscape that you've described over the last 2 hours and you're trying to think strategically of, okay, we've got a daunting task ahead of us. What is one of the low-hanging fruits that we can take advantage of? It's let's not give up the Bitcoin advantage that we have right now. The Americans own the most Bitcoin. We have the most companies being domiciled here that are enabling the Bitcoin economy and all the tools that are being built on the top of the protocol layer. And so considering the fact that we've seeded ground in terms of energy, manufacturing base, defense tech to a certain degree, all right, what are the strategic assets that do exist within our borders and that we should covet and work to enhance? And to me, Bitcoin seems like the only logical conclusion of the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah, I mean, I was explaining this to someone as like, just in the pure like hedge scenario, right? Like if there's a scenario in the next 5 years where Bitcoin monetizes to parity with gold, how should you position now the United States to maximize the benefits of that development and minimize the risks, right? Because if you imagine a counterfactual where Americans don't hold a large amount of Bitcoin, where Bitcoin miners are not, in significant presence in the United States, and that transition happens, then that benefit will accrue to what are likely going to be authoritarian inclined adversaries or sort of middle powers, and it will just strengthen their power relative to us. Whereas if that transition happens and Bitcoin monetizes to the level of gold and maybe at the expense of gold, well, our adversaries have really doubled down on gold, right? The BRICS essentially, like Russia's stockpiling gold, China's been stockpiling gold. The traditional kind of standby safe haven asset for a large portion of the global South and Eurasia has been gold, right? So if their kind of backup plan in a increasingly contested, if not outright global conflict environment is just hedged with gold, and our sole plan essentially just is to double down on the treasury security market, right? That seems like a strategic mistake. I mean, yeah, do what you can to like extract as much free value out of the essentially willingness of people to hold treasury securities over the next 5 or 10 years. Like, do that, sure. If people are willing to hold long-term bonds, like they make their own decisions. Like, that's fine. So plan to extract as much wealth out of those people as possible, right? Put those people in the treasury market killing pen for the next 10 years. But then what's your backup plan if people decide to really flip? And Bitcoin is, I think, a perfect hedge for that, because we have right now disproportionate share of Bitcoin to the world. So if it were to monetize to the level of gold or at the expense of gold, we would stand to gain disproportionately relative to our adversaries. So that just seems like a pretty basic thing. It doesn't even require the federal government to own Bitcoin. It just requires, keeping and having incentive and having policies that don't scare Bitcoin away from the United States, that don't push the Bitcoin into the Emirates, into Hong Kong, into Singapore, et cetera. And that's, that seems like a basic sound policy. Is like, you want Americans, American businesses to benefit relative to our adversaries. And so that's like a pretty, I see like zero downside to that plan. So we'll see what happens, but that seems to be the straightforward, strategic orientation at this point.
As the great Michael Goldstein once said, the only winning move is to play. And I'm hopeful. I think people are starting to wake up to this. I'm hopeful. Got a long road ahead of us. We are 15 minutes over our allotted time, and I was 15 minutes late due to putting up with some terrible twos downstairs. And I'm going to respect your time, Matthew. I can't believe it took us this long. Hopefully this is the first of many conversations. Thank you for all the work that you do to educate people about this and position Bitcoin as an important strategic asset in the minds of people on Capitol Hill. And I always feel smarter coming away from conversations with you. So selfishly, I'd like to thank you for your time to help illuminate the landscape of what's going on in the geopolitical world and in the private sector globally as well. Because I think it is undeniable that we're in this insanely chaotic inflection point. And I think you bring a lot of clarity to what's happening between the different variables that are moving on the chessboard.
Doing my best. It's a messy place.
You don't seem too enthused to be doing your best. Is it?
I mean, it's funny. It's like the demand for my skills goes up just before we hit World War III, and then I basically become completely useless. I have zero marketable skills at that point. So I guess I'll ride that escalator up and then take the elevator down.
Yeah, then you just fall back to goats and other stuff. That's when you just go buy a farm and just chill. And
yeah, I have to get my hands dirty at that point. So TBD.
Yeah, I think you have marketable skills beyond the lead up to World War III. Hopefully we don't get there. Seems like, hey, maybe that's like the last question. And we can keep it short. Yes or no answer. Has World War III started already?
Yes. I think it's a short answer. Yeah. I think if I would define, I say that the shorter way to say it is that great power war is too expensive to fight on a world war, but we're still fighting a world war. We're just fighting it in sort of the boundaries of great power sovereignty. So where we're fighting it is in space. We're fighting it in cyberspace. We're fighting it underwater, fiber cables and pipelines. We're fighting it in weak states in Africa, South America. We're fighting it in proxy states, in a hot war in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East and across the Eurasian periphery, including in the border between India and Pakistan, South China Sea with the Philippines, obviously Taiwan Strait and North Korean Peninsula. So I think that arc of instability, both geographically around the Eurasian Peninsula and then in space and undersea and in the Arctic, are active zones of great power conflict. Like cyberspace is a conflict zone. Space is a conflict zone. We are blowing things up and cutting cables undersea. Where we're supporting proxy wars and killing soldiers with missiles and arms provided by either side. We haven't yet gotten to the point where great powers themselves are engaged in open conflict, with traditional military forces, but we're sort of just below that threshold. So the question is whether we stay below that threshold or whether an accident or a strategic miscalculation tips us over. I don't think anyone can predict You can have proxy wars. You can have that sort of state of kind of Cold War with sort of kinetic conflicts propping up. You can have that sustained for quite a long time. Like we saw that during the early part of the Cold War with Russia. This one's a bit more complicated and takes into account many different players. So it's probably a lot more unstable than that dynamic was. So yeah, I think of no other way to conflict that it is a world war in the sense that it's a conflict of global scale. It's just not great powers, launching missiles directly at each other. But we are, doing lots of other stuff just below the threshold.
All right. World War III started, freaks. We'll end on that. Peace and love.